Robert shifted a little uncomfortably in his chair, then said, "As a matter of fact, that's why I'm here. You know she's been my wife's best friend for a long time, and 2 days ago, Carrie stopped by to visit her. I told Carrie what I thought about her cheating on you with her boss, and afterward, Carrie and Susan retired to the kitchen to talk privately. I went out to the garage because I was too angry with her to stay there. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Robert, but I don't want to come between you and your sister. What's done is done, and I'm trying to move on with my life. Well, she's my little sister, and I know that in time it will come between me and her, but right now, I don't really need her. I know my parents aren't thrilled either, but they'll stick by her no matter what." Mark glanced glumly at his beer and said, "Family first." Robert continued, "Anyway, I left the kitchen door ajar when I went to the garage and overheard their conversation. Although I wasn't interested in talking to her, I decided to hear what Carrie had to say for herself. I went and sat by the kitchen door and just listened." Mark was obviously interested in what Robert had to say, so he leaned forward and asked, "Did she have anything to say about it?" "I'm still trying to figure out what she found in this guy besides his money. I think you hit the sweet spot. I can't quote them word for word, but I can give you the gist of their conversation. When you caught her emailing you, she quickly made the decision to dump you and go to her boss. She realized you would never forgive her, so she chose Plan B. Wasn't she already committed to him?" Mark asked, looking a little puzzled. "Apparently not. From what I've heard, she told Susan that while the gifts and lifestyle with Bradley are great, she said you outclass him by a mile in the bedroom. She said she would have broken up with him very soon, maybe even next week, if you hadn't caught her. Would have, could have, should have. It doesn't matter now." Mark drank more from his bottle and leaned back in his chair. "She understands that. She knows it's over. I just thought you might be interested to know that she's really regretting all of this right now. That hasn't stopped her from going full speed ahead with the divorce, of course. I got the new papers from the court today. I guess Trey has a friendly judge who is speeding up the process for her. I never heard anything about it from her, but I've heard them both use the expression starter husband. It sounds like they've talked about it before, and when she first started dating him, she thought he'd be a step up for her. The other thing is that Susan obviously knew about all of this from the beginning. I'm so upset with Susan that I hesitate to bring it up with her for fear of what I might say. So she thinks of me as her starter husband. Isn't that wonderful?" Mark paused to get his anger under control before continuing, "I don't want you fighting with Susan over me, Robert. It wasn't just Carrie who thought that. From the tone of their conversation, it sounds like Susan may have harbored the same thoughts as Carrie. I'm going to talk to her about all of this as soon as I feel I can without losing my temper. My wife has a lot to answer for." The conversation continued for another half hour, after which Robert got up to leave. He added a few more minor details from the overheard conversation, but nothing of significance to Mark, who was still thinking about his starter husband status when he finally fell asleep a couple of hours later. The next day, after work, Mark stopped by one of the larger grocery stores on his way home. He decided it was time to start eating healthier, something better than the fast food he had been eating for the past 6 weeks. He had just put his items on the checkout line when the cashier asked, "Aren't you Mark Riley?" Mark looked up and immediately recognized her as a former classmate. "Hi, Wendy, I didn't realize you worked here. It's been a while." They continued their pleasant conversation while Wendy checked his order. After paying, Mark asked, "Weren't you very friendly with Carol Reese? Have you heard anything about what became of her or her mother?" Wendy thought for a moment before answering. "I remember hearing that she got married, but that was years ago. Her mother still lives in the same house, although she remarried a few years ago." "I haven't heard that. Do you know Mrs. Reese's new last name?" Wendy thought a moment longer and replied, "Smith, I think. Perhaps Smitherman or Smithson." Agreeing to meet sometime for coffee, the old friends said their goodbyes. Returning home, Mark was in a better mood than he had been in a long time. Meeting an old friend had brought back many fond memories, and he was grateful for any opportunity to take his mind off thoughts of his soon-to-be ex-wife. After cooking himself a healthy dinner, he went for a short jog for the first time in weeks to warm up for what he decided would be his new nightly routine: proper nutrition followed by regular exercise. Shortly after returning from his jog, he decided to look up Carol's mother's phone number and soon found it in the phone book under the name Smithers. Realizing that time was of the essence, he dialed the number. Soon, Mark was on the phone with Marianne Smithers and got straight to the point. "I was hoping to get Carol's address. I thought I might write to her just to say hi. I was just on my way out to see her. Her name is Carol Jansen now, and you don't need to write to her, you can just call her." She gave him the phone number and added that Carol was now a widow. Since she was in a hurry to leave, they said a quick goodbye. After their conversation, Mark found Carol Jansen in the phone book and noticed that her address was in an area of town known as a disadvantaged, low-income neighborhood. He was quite surprised by this and wondered why Carol would live there. He decided that one day he would be sure to call her. Over the next few days, Mark's new healthy lifestyle affected his attitude towards life, and he was now much more upbeat. At work, he began to imagine that life without Carrie was possible after all. Just as he was beginning to come around, a new letter from Carrie got him thinking. It was a very short letter consisting of just one line that simply said, "I never thought of you as a starter husband." It was obvious that Robert and Susan had discussed what Robert had been pondering when he left Mark a few days ago. Susan had apparently relayed the information that Robert had overheard the women talking and passed it on to Mark. That message brought back to Mark everything he had been trying to forget. After pondering her message for a few minutes, he sent her a reply: "Actions speak louder than words." She never responded to that comment. Almost exactly 3 months after Carrie left their home for Trey, Mark received the final divorce papers. Trey's apparent ability to get those papers through the system surprised him. Returning from his usual run, he celebrated his status as one of the newly divorced with a single glass of cold beer. After finishing it, he went to his computer and sent Carrie a text: "You got what you wanted." It was the last email between them, and she never responded to it. Later that evening, after rereading and putting the divorce decree away in a folder, Mark decided it was time to call Carol Jansen and say hi. He had thought about calling her several times over the past few weeks since he had been given her number, but wasn't ready to take that step yet. Since he was divorced and she was a widow, he thought that perhaps they could share a dinner or a couple of drinks one night to reminisce about old times. With that thought in mind, he dialed her number. When she answered, he had just had time to introduce himself when she said, "Mark, I'm so glad you called. My mom told me you called, and I was beginning to think you had decided not to call me." The two old friends spent the next hour telling each other about the highlights of their lives after graduation. Mark learned that Carol had married Frank Jansen in her last year of university. He was in the National Guard and was called up to serve in Iraq. 3 months after his arrival there, she received word that a man on a bicycle had blown himself up at the checkpoint her husband was guarding, killing him and another soldier. This left her a widow with a 4-year-old daughter, Chrissy. The two of them lived on the survivor pension she received from the Army, but as soon as her daughter was old enough to go to school, Carol planned to return to her specialty work as a therapist. Mark, for his part, told Carol about his new status and some of the details of how and why he had become newly divorced. Eventually, it was time for them to say goodbye as Carol needed to put her daughter to bed. Mark decided that now would be a good time to see if Carol would be interested in dating him. "So, Carol, what do you think about getting together for dinner or a couple of drinks one night?" Carol hesitated before answering, "I'm sorry, Mark, but I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Right now, I'm more concerned about my daughter than anything else. Maybe some other time." Mark was very disappointed, for he had thought they would be reunited after all these years. "It's okay, Carol. I hope I didn't upset you with my questions. Goodbye and good luck, Carol." He found her response disheartening, so he quickly hung up. The fact that he was officially divorced and then rejected by his old girlfriend made him return to the refrigerator for another beer. After finishing it, he went straight to bed. It had been an emotionally difficult day for him. The next 2 months went by quickly. Mark had gotten used to the routine and knew that eventually he would have to decide what to do with the rest of his life. He knew there was no point in getting into a new relationship, so he put that part of his life on hold, wanting to wait until Carrie was banished to the back of his mind. He still found it difficult to go more than a few hours without thinking about her, although he could tell that those recurring memories were becoming less and less disturbing to him as time passed. Mark had given up newspaper delivery months ago when he'd given up his landline phone and premium cable channels in an attempt to cut costs. Now he preferred to read newspapers left in the lunchroom by coworkers who often didn't bring them to work. Occasionally, he listened to the local news on the radio, but again, not on a regular basis. It was in this uninformed state that he went to work that morning. During his morning coffee break, he was having a lively conversation with another mechanic when one of them threw a newspaper in front of him and said, "You better read this, Mark." Mark picked up the paper and read the headline, "One dead, one in critical condition." The accompanying article told of a fatal accident the night before on the road leading away from the local country club. The driver lost control of the car, and it went into a ditch where it rolled over several times. The driver, identified as Bradley Knox III, was ejected from the car. The passenger, Carrie Riley, suffered serious injuries and is now in intensive care at a local hospital. The police report indicated that alcohol may have caused the accident. After rereading the article twice, Mark threw the paper back to the man who gave it to him and said, "Can't say I'm sorry to see him dead. I hope Carrie pulls through, but other than that, I think I care about her too much to worry." The man looked at him carefully and then said, "Are you sure, Mark? I know her leaving hit you hard. You were pretty much useless around here for a while," he said, laughing. "Yeah, I'm sure it did. Reading that article proved it to me. Now I have only normal human compassion for her. I have not the slightest desire to rush to her bedside." Reading that article was a turning point for Mark. He could now admit to himself that he had indeed moved on from Carrie and felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. As much as he felt sorry for her and her parents, he was happy that he had reached the point where he realized he could move on with his life. Over the next few days, local news outlets confirmed that Bradley Knox III was under the influence of alcohol when he drove off the road. In the same reports, Carrie was still unconscious and in critical condition. Mark's reaction to this news was to invite one of the secretaries over for dinner, which they both enjoyed. He was very pleased to be enjoying the company of women again. They made no plans for future dates, but it was enough for Mark to know that he was completely out of the rut he had been in for so long. About 2 weeks after the accident, well after it was no longer news, Mark answered a late evening knock on the door and found Robert Kane there. He invited him in, and soon both men were sitting in the kitchen, each with a cold bottle of beer in his hand. "What brings you here, Robert?" "It's been a while." "Nothing much, Mark. I was in the neighborhood, as they say. I was sorry to hear about the accident Carrie was in. I think it's very disturbing to your family. There hasn't been anything in the papers lately. Is she feeling any better?" Robert took a long sip of beer before answering. "Yes, it's been terribly hard on Mom and Dad. She had a pretty serious head injury when she was thrown back while the car was moving. Thank goodness she was wearing her seatbelt. That jackass she was riding with didn't buckle up, and she paid for it. Looks like Carrie paid a big price for his decision to drink and drive. Someone should sue his estate for her injuries." Robert sighed and said, "Yeah, Dad and I talked about that. Carrie is still in a drug-induced coma. She had to have major brain surgery because of the blow to her head. Once the swelling goes down, they will take her off the drugs and see if she comes out of the coma or not. They don't make any guarantees. I didn't know she was in such bad shape. The news always just said she was in the ICU. Tell your parents hello when you see them." Robert looked at Mark and said, "I will. Thanks for your concern." They were actually wondering why you didn't stop by the hospital. I tried to explain to them that you have your own life now and Carrie is no longer a part of it. Mark laughed softly and said, "Yeah, I think I've been able to move on with my life now. I went on my first date in years the other day. While I'm sorry she was hurt so badly, I'm not going to let it affect my life. A year ago, I would have lost my mind in this situation, but Carrie has spared me from that." They continued talking about sports and work and didn't return to the subject of Carrie until the very end of Robert's visit. As he was about to walk out the door, he said, "By the way, Mark, I think Susan and I have gotten over that whole problem I talked to you about last time. She saw the mess Carrie was in before the accident and decided she would be more than happy to be my wife. I guess this is a case where the grass always seems greener." "I'm glad to hear that, Robert." It was probably Carrie who confused Susan. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Carrie forgot her obligations to me and our marriage. It could have been much worse. We could have had children. They shook hands, and Robert left to return to his home. Another 6 weeks passed quickly for Mark. He heard nothing more about what had happened to Carrie and assumed her recovery was going well. Mark was able to become more involved in dating, and during this time, he went out on average once a week. He went out a couple of times with Jean, the receptionist from work, and spent a couple of nights with her at her apartment. Neither of them expected their relationship to go too far, but they both enjoyed their time together. The nights in her bed had helped him get rid of his last doubts about getting back into the dating pool. It was a Thursday evening, and Mark had just returned from his evening run when he heard the doorbell of his house ring. Opening the door, he was very surprised to see his former father-in-law on the doorstep. "Come in, Joseph." "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" The elderly man stopped on the threshold and said, "I can't come in right now as I am on my way to the hospital. I would like to ask you to come to the hospital and see Carrie with her mother and me. She just arrived this week. Finally, we were hoping you could meet us there tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Mark looked at him curiously and replied, "I guess I can, but what's the big deal? Why do you need me to visit her? Our marriage has been over for a long time." Joseph breathed a sigh of relief and said, "We'd just like you to meet us there if you can. We'll talk things over then. Right now, I'm in a big hurry. I'll see you tomorrow." The older man quickly turned around and hurried back to his car, leaving Mark standing at his own front door in bewilderment. The next day, Mark rearranged his schedule so that he could have a late lunch and then start the weekend early by making the agreed-upon trip to the hospital. That's what happened. He left the store at 1 p.m., and instead of stopping for lunch, snacked on fruit from his bag as he drove. He arrived at the hospital early but decided to go up to Carrie's room anyway. Maybe he could get it done even faster than planned. It was already 2:30 when he stepped off the elevator on Carrie's floor. He'd been given the room number at the front desk on the first floor, and he saw right away that it was directly across from the nurse's station. He hadn't noticed it affecting him before, but now it was obvious that he was actually a little nervous. He hadn't seen Carrie since his angry visit to her office with Crosby and Knox and hadn't even exchanged emails with her in months. He was sure this could be a strain on him. Taking a deep breath, he quietly stepped through the open door of her private room and froze, staring intently at the scene before him. Carrie was clearly asleep, her shoulder-length blonde hair now only 2 inches long, obviously shaved off weeks ago for surgery. At least one scar was visible on the right side of her head, not yet completely hidden by the growing hair. To her right was an infusion pump leading to an IV in her right arm. To her left was a rack on which stood the heart monitoring equipment. The screen displayed a continuous heart rate monitor along with numbers showing her pulse rate, blood pressure, and oxygen percentage. A bundle of wires ran from the machine to sensors attached to her body. To avoid waking her up, Mark decided to wait for her parents to arrive. He was actually delighted to see her again. She was as beautiful as ever. Her face and neck bore no marks of the accident, nor did her hands and arms. Only the scar on her head testified to the terrible accident she had been involved in. For a moment, he had the urge to walk over and take her hand, but it quickly passed when he remembered the contents of the letters he had found so long ago. His jaw clenched, and he reaffirmed his intention to wait. He had been watching her for about 2 minutes when her eyes slowly opened and focused on him. As if a switch had been turned on, her face suddenly lit up, and she said, "Mark, you're here. Where have you been? I've missed you so much these past 3 days. No one could tell me where you were." Mark was completely taken aback by her reaction and questions and replied, "Where do you think I've been? I've been home and at work." Carrie reacted to that answer with a confused look and asked, "Why weren't you here when I woke up? Why would you go to work or stay home when I was here?" His confusion was even worse than hers, and he was a little angry at her questions. He quickly replied, "Why would you wait here for me? We are divorced. You left me for your lover. Why the hell should I visit you? I'm only here because your parents wanted me to come." Her reaction completely surprised and amazed Mark as she immediately shrieked and tried to move toward him. She was obviously extremely agitated and spoke, "No, no, no. What are you saying?" She began waving her arms around, trying to free herself from the restraining equipment and tubing. After a few seconds, she ripped the 4 out of her right arm. The alarm on the infusion pump sounded a steady beep and was soon joined by the loud and shrill beeping of the heart monitoring equipment. When Carrie managed to pull hard enough on the cables to disconnect them from the machine, a few seconds after, the alarm sounded. 2 nurses came running in from a neighboring room. The first of them looked at Mark and asked, "What did you do to her?" She then rushed past him to Carrie, grabbed her by her twitching arms, and forced her back onto the bed. She paid no attention when Mark answered her question, "I didn't do anything. I was here at the door the whole time." Carrie mumbled something incoherently, trying to break free from the nurse's strong arms. The second nurse quickly assessed the situation and said, "I'll get the restraints and call the doctor for permission to sedate her." She turned and hurriedly left the room. Mark walked slowly out of the hospital room, finally turning around and shaking his head as he headed for the elevator. "I think she's crazy," he said to no one in particular as he reached the elevator. The doors opened, and Carrie's parents stepped out in front of Mark. Before they could say a word to him, screams and yelling came from Carrie's room, and their attention was caught by a nurse rushing into the room with staples and a hypodermic syringe in hand. "What happened?" Carrie's mother looked at Mark fearfully and continued, "You didn't talk to her, did you?" When he answered in the affirmative, she said, "Good God, no," and the 2 of them rushed past him into her room. Mark was completely confused by the strange situation unfolding in front of him, and after watching and listening to what was happening for a few seconds, he reached out and pressed the elevator down button. As he entered the elevator and the doors began to close in front of him, he saw Carrie's father leave the room, obviously looking for him. Mark managed to raise his hand in a farewell greeting before the doors closed completely, satisfied that he was able to start the weekend even earlier than he expected. Mark drove straight home after leaving the hospital. On the way, he reviewed the strange scenes that had taken place before his eyes in Carrie's room. None of it made any sense to him, and he decided to forget about it. He tried to fulfill Joseph Kane's request, but Carrie's reaction to his visit quickly put an end to his efforts. He was sure she was left with psychological problems from the accident that he could happily leave to her parents and doctors. Let them deal with it, he decided. After he showered and changed his clothes, what he had been thinking about from time to time over the past few weeks came back to him. He decided to call Carol Jansen one last time, hoping that she might reconsider her refusal to join him for dinner. If she refused again, he decided that he would call Jean at the office and invite her over for the evening. He felt he needed female company to take his mind off Carrie and her strange behaviors. He almost hung up when the phone started ringing, not knowing if he would want to meet another of Carol's refusals to go out with him. But the opportunity to do so disappeared when Carol picked up the phone. "Hi Carol, this is Mark Riley calling. I hope I didn't catch you busy." "Mark, no, I'm not busy at all. I'm so glad you called me again. I've tried several times to contact you, but the number listed in the book doesn't work. I was afraid you had moved or something." I wanted to apologize for being so harsh with you the last time you asked me out. You don't need to apologize, Carol. I'm old enough to handle rejection, he said. Actually, I called to see if you've changed your mind and would like to have dinner with me tonight or tomorrow night. He waited patiently to see what excuse she would offer. Carol hesitated before replying, I have plans with my mom and stepdad tomorrow. It's their anniversary. After another hesitation, she continued, I'm afraid tonight is canceled too because I couldn't find a babysitter for Chrissy on such short notice. She was genuinely unhappy that she had to turn him down. You know, there's a simple solution. We can just take Chrissy with us. You've told me so much about her, I'd really like to meet her. After that, Mark decided that if she made any more excuses, it would be clear that she wasn't interested in going out with him. Carol laughed and said, I doubt you've ever gone out to dinner with a 4-year-old, have you? Taking a child with you puts serious restrictions on the restaurants you can go to. Well, maybe pick a place where she's comfortable. I just know I'd like to take you out, and a family restaurant seems like a great option. He waited patiently for her answer, realizing it was now or never. Deep down, he really wanted her to say yes. He believed the two of them had unfinished business. Their breakup after high school was due to the realities of their curriculums, not some obvious mismatch of feelings. If you're serious, there's this restaurant that Chrissy really likes. The food and atmosphere there are very nice, even though it's considered a family restaurant. There's a great dessert bar there that Chrissy just loves. Then it's settled. I'll pick you up at 5. You'll have to tell me where the place is, Mark said, very pleased, his pleasure evident in the tone of his voice. Carol was excited too as she replied, You don't mind taking Chrissy? Are you sure about that? Mark laughed and replied, Absolutely, if she's anything like her mother, I'm sure she'll be a pleasure to hang out with. I've always found you to be one of the most polite and well-mannered people I've ever met. They continued to banter with each other until Carol said it was time for her to leave to get them both ready to leave. Mark was thrilled to be on the phone. He was happier than he had ever been in a long time. He sincerely hoped that their evening would be everything he had envisioned it to be. Later that night, as he lay in bed waiting for sleep to fall over him, Mark went over the details of his date with Carol and Chrissy in his head. He lay there smiling, pleased with how well it had turned out. Now, he was looking forward to Sunday morning, for he had agreed to accompany them both to church, a Sunday ritual he had weaned himself on years ago. It wasn't that he was anxious to hear the sermon, it was just that he wanted to spend more time with the 2 Jansen women he had just invited to dinner. He remembered the beginning of their evening as he pulled up to the apartment building where Carol lived. He was shocked by the beautiful woman who met him at the door, so changed in so many little ways from what he remembered of her. Their last meeting had been over 10 years ago. Her dark hair was now cut short, which suited her well. For some reason, she seemed taller, but he was sure it was just an artifact of his memory. She had gotten fat in all the right places, but the beautiful smile and dark eyes he remembered were still there. The first time he saw her, it took his breath away. Chrissy looked like a miniature of her mother, with the same dark hair and eyes. Carol said she had her father's nose and chin, though Mark thought to himself that even in those areas, she looked more like her mother. Chrissy shook his hand gently when they were introduced, and he noticed that she was scrutinizing him closely, so closely that Mark wondered if the child would object to him showing interest in her mother. He had heard of several cases where incompatibility with children doomed any relationship between their parents and a potential suitor. His fears were quickly dispelled when Chrissy agreed to hold his hand as they walked from Carol's car to the restaurant. They used her car so they wouldn't have to swap the car seat for their own, and he drove while Carol got her bearings and Chrissy gave comments from her seat in the back. By the time they reached their destination, Mark had grown quite fond of the skittish girl. Their dinner together went very well, and they managed to find plenty of topics to talk about. Chrissy often interjected into the conversation, usually asking what's empty, where empty meant a word either of them had used that she didn't quite understand. Mark found this habit of hers quite amusing, while Carol seemed slightly embarrassed by the frequent interruptions. When the main course was finished, Mark managed to get Chrissy to go with him to the dessert counter, where the two of them selected and prepared the desserts they each wanted. Carol asked for soft-serve ice cream with chocolate sauce, and Mark managed to get Chrissy up to prepare her mother's order. Mark's choice was simple, a slice of apple pie with ice cream, and again, Chrissy did the job while he cheered her on. Her own dessert choice took the longest, as she couldn't decide which of the 3 toppings to put on the ice cream, and Mark made her a friend for life when he suggested she get all 3. The trip to Carol's was a continuation of the good times they had enjoyed at the restaurant. Mark walked them to the door of Carol's apartment, but all his thoughts of hugging her or kissing her goodbye were dispelled when Chrissy took her mother's hand and pulled her until she agreed to take the girl to her room, bathe her, and read her a book before bedtime. It was past noon on Sunday when Carol stopped in front of Mark's house to drop him off after church and the brunch they had at IHOP. Chrissy was busy talking about animals, and Mark didn't notice that there were people waiting for him to return until Carol said, "I think someone is standing at your front door." Mark looked around and said, "Those are my former in-laws. I wonder what they want. I guess I'd better go see." Chrissy quickly got his attention back by saying, "Don't forget to take me to the zoo." She seemed worried that his unexpected company would somehow interfere with their plans for the afternoon. "I won't forget, Chrissy. You'll come back for me after you change, and I'll take you to the zoo, I promise." He smiled at the girl and her mother before getting out of the car. He stood and waved goodbye to them as they drove away, and then turned to his guests and asked, "What brings you here on such a beautiful Sunday afternoon?" Carol's mother, Nancy, was the first to speak. "We need to talk to you. It's very important." You could tell by the look on her face that she was upset. "Sure, I'm leaving around 2 o'clock, but we can come into the house and have a cup of coffee and talk if you'd like." They went into the house and joined Mark in the kitchen, where he started making coffee, and they sat down at the table, and Nancy Kane started talking. "Carrie is in a terrible state, Mark. Ever since you came to see us, she has had to be sedated constantly. As soon as the medication wears off and she comes to her senses, she becomes hysterical. What is the cause, and what does it have to do with me? When we asked you to meet with us on Friday, we wanted you to meet with her neurologist first. We wanted him to explain to you the condition she is in." "I'm sorry, I didn't know, but what difference does it make?" "I've hardly told her anything anyway," Nancy whimpered, and her husband took her hand before she continued. "The problem is that you told her about her affair and the divorce. We wanted to try to avoid that until she got stronger." Mark was puzzled and quickly asked, "Why wouldn't I mention her affair and divorce? Surely she didn't expect me to forget about it now that Trey is dead. She won't get me back by default just because he's no longer in the world." Mark was starting to get a little upset at that assumption. Joseph picked up the conversation. "Carrie had a severe head injury and almost died. Part of her temporal lobe was physically damaged, and the swelling may have affected other areas. Her doctor explained to us that she was suffering from retrograde amnesia." "Amnesia? How can that be?" "She recognized me immediately." "I assume she recognized the two of you as well," Mark said as he poured coffee into 3 cups, and Joseph stopped to take a sip from his cup. "It's not that she's lost all her memory. The problem is that she's lost almost everything from the last year and a half or so, as well as scattered memories of earlier periods. When she went to the hospital, the doctors ran a lot of tests, and she was found to have large gaps in her memories of the recent past. She thinks you two just recently returned from Cancun." As Joseph spoke, Mark poured coffee into 3 cups, and Joseph stopped to take a sip from his cup. "They think that in time, she'll be able to recall a lot more of the missing pieces of her memory, but they don't know when or how much will come back to her. It's like she's the main character in the movie The Bourne Identity," Joseph continued. "So you're telling me she doesn't remember the divorce or even the affair she had? I guess I could lie to her, but eventually, I'd have to tell her the truth. Like I said, she won't get a free pass just because Trey is dead," Mark said. Joseph couldn't wait to continue, so he said, "We don't have to tell her lies. If we do, she may form memories that aren't really true. The doctor explained that we must tell her the truth so that we can recover the memories that are still there." Her mind will fill in the gaps where something is missing, and if we tell her something completely untrue, her mind can incorporate it as a false recovered memory. Mark was puzzled and said, "Then we're back to where we started. You say I should have told her about the affair and the divorce. Not exactly the doctor's advice. In situations like this, was not to lie, just to skirt the truth. He wanted us to start giving her little bits of information so she could put the puzzle together properly. You're kind of overloading her with information. The doctor thinks some of it may have triggered memories of the affair and the divorce, but we don't know how much of that yet," Joseph said. As soon as Nancy Kane regained her composure, she expressed her feelings by saying, "She is not very strong yet. The news you gave her has upset her a lot. They are going to start her on another medication, and hopefully, we will be able to talk to her about everything again very soon." As Mark continued to talk, he began to feel a little embarrassed by the things he had said. "I'm sorry if I made things worse. I didn't realize the situation she was in." "That's okay, Mark. We hope you can help us with her by bringing back some of her lost memories. We would like to take all of your photo albums, as the doctors say that the pictures can trigger memories that will help her reconnect with some of the lost ones. Anything else you have that might help her remember would be nice too," Nancy said in response. Mark stood up and walked over to the kitchen sink, where he stood looking out the window. He did this because he was interested in the photo albums that were being discussed. An expression of bewilderment appeared on Nancy's face as she asked, "What do you mean they're not here?" "I can't help you with the albums, they're not here," she said. He turned and began walking down the hallway, saying, "I can explain that if I print out an email for you." He was gone for several minutes, during which time Carrie's parents consoled each other. "I mean, they're gone, they left with my trash months ago," he said on his way out of the room. After Mark had returned, he presented the elderly couple with a piece of paper that had been printed out. They were impressed. "A few months ago, I deleted all the pictures I wanted to keep from our albums. A few days after that, I sent the following message to Carrie's work email," he explained to Nancy as he passed the paper. "I deleted all the pictures I wanted from our albums. Any that were left I put in a box so you can do the same. Let me know where you want them sent." The arrow that pointed to the apartment, that's the kind of answer I got from her. "Do whatever you want with them, I'm not interested." I kept them for a few weeks after that, but finally decided that if she didn't want them, and neither did I could throw them out with the trash. So that's what I did. I'm sorry. The expressions on Joseph and Nancy's faces were shock and horror. They were unable to express their feelings. After giving the matter some thought, Mark continued by saying, "There are a few other things I can give you besides this message. I'll go get them. It'll take me about 15 minutes, so pour yourself some more coffee." Mark then returned to the computer room, and upon his return, it was only 15 minutes before he came back. Upon his return to the kitchen table, he was holding a stack of papers as well as a CD that was contained within a box. I ended up printing out the entire collection of letters that I had used to learn about the affair. Nancy reached out to take them and begin reading them. Mark immediately took them from her hands and said, "There are some very explicit passages in some of these letters." He then placed the stack in front of Nancy, who reached out to take them. "Perhaps if Carrie reads them, they will bring back some of her memories. Because I am aware of the impact that they had on me, I can't say for certain that you should read them. But consider yourself warned if you decide to read them yourself." He added copies of all the legal letters that had been sent to him, including the warning letter after his visit to the Crosby and Knox's office. The last item was a CD on which he had labeled Canon. He handed it to them and said, "These pictures were on the computer, and they are all I have left of our time together. Moreover, I ought to caution you about them as well. A nudist beach was one of the places that Carrie and I went to while we were there, and that is where all of these photographs were taken. As a matter of fact, there is a singular photograph that depicts us dressed and seated in lounge chairs on the beach. Carrie should probably look at the others on her own." Carrie's mother folded the papers and CD in front of her. Mark thought it was an awfully small stack to summarize their marriage. He hoped it would help Carrie. They sat in silence for a few seconds before Nancy said, I don't think you're going to want to come to Carrie and talk to her about everything that happened between you two. Mark thought for a moment before replying, I don't think so, at least not right now. If she wants to talk to me after she reads all of this and realizes what she did to our marriage, give me a call, and I might consider it. I suppose it's impossible for you to consider trying to start over with her, her father said with a look of hope on his face. I'm afraid I could never do that. After spending all of these months attempting to rid myself of my feelings for her, I simply cannot take the chance that she might turn around and behave in the same manner toward me once more. Trey's wealth and position in society were prioritized over mine, and I will never allow her to have the opportunity to do that to me again. I will never give her that opportunity. There was something in her character that made it possible for her to do that, and I find it hard to believe that a blow to the head could have altered that aspect of her personality. Even if I could believe it was possible, I just wouldn't take the chance. Joseph and Nancy agreed that they understood his feelings on the matter, but they thanked him, offering to talk to Carrie later if she wished. The three of them were walking out the front door, exchanging parting words when Carol and her daughter appeared in the driveway. Chrissy immediately informed the older couple, We're going to the zoo, we're going to see the elephants. The Canes were quick to greet mother and daughter and even quicker to appreciate them before getting in their car and driving away, apologizing for not being ready. Mark invited Carol and Chrissy to come inside and wait while he changed. He was ready in just a couple of minutes, and the happy trio were soon on their way to the zoo. Another month passed, and Mark was happier than ever. He met with Carol and Chrissy at least once a week, but there was no way they could find a way to turn their relationship into a sexual one. Chrissy had managed to quash the idea several times out of her own free will. Her inability to sleep when he was in the apartment was beginning to frustrate Mark. It must have been frustrating for Carol as well, since she suggested that they find a babysitter for their next date. That day came, and Mark looked forward to it. They made plans to watch a movie and hit up a popular bar for some dancing, and Carol's mom agreed to watch Chrissy. The happy couple was leaving Carol's apartment that evening. It was the first time they had been able to get together as a couple. The movie and dance went very well, and at midnight, Mark suggested they stop by his house for a cup of coffee since they were nearby. Carol agreed with a smile but warned him that she couldn't count on her mother staying late. As they entered the house, Mark said, If you prefer wine instead of coffee, I have several bottles in the basement. When Carol agreed that was a good idea, he quickly pulled out a bottle for them to try. They had already been sipping wine and dancing to his large CD collection for half an hour when Mark led her back to the living room couch. After a couple of the sweetest kisses, he pulled out of her embrace and picked up his cell phone. What are you doing? Carol inquired with a grin on her face. I'm beginning to like this already. Mark pressed a finger to her lips and said, Give me a minute. Carol looked at Mark with a smile on her face. Carol was taken aback and attempted to grab the phone, indicating that she did not want to bother her mother. I want to talk to your babysitter, she said. What are you doing by calling her? She was alternately embarrassed and laughing as she tried unsuccessfully to reach his cell phone. The call was quickly answered, and Carol stopped struggling for the phone when she heard Mark say, This is Mark calling. Everything is fine, but I'd like to ask you something, Mrs. Smithers. Okay, Marianne, I was wondering if you were anxious to get home. I was hoping Carol could stay a little later. I understand. Good, that sounds wonderful. More time passed without speaking, almost a full minute before Mark said, I really like the way you think, Marianne. Yes, I will tell her exactly what you told me, but she won't have to wash the sheets. I'll do that. Another short pause followed before Mark continued, I'll see you then. Have I mentioned how much I like the way you think? Goodbye, Marianne. Mark laughed, ending the conversation, and Carol looked at him in confusion. Mark gave another very good laugh before saying, I'll tell you what we talked about. I think I'm going to really like your mom, not that I haven't liked her before, she and I have always gotten along great. He paused and laughed some more before continuing his statement. What the hell was that, Mark? Carol's confusion was evident, and it was clear that she did not comprehend what Mark had communicated to her over the phone. So tell me, Mark, what did she say? Well, your stepfather, Gary, joined her at your apartment. Chrissy is fine and sleeping soundly, and your mother and Gary are doing the same thing there that we were just doing here on the couch. She told me that he had a doctor's appointment today and came to your apartment to tell me that he had a prescription for some little blue pills. Mark continued to laugh a bit before continuing, your mom insists that you stay here tonight because they're going to sleep in your bed. Well, she didn't quite put it that way. She said they don't have pajamas, so we'll have to sleep like this. A look of complete shock appeared on Carol's face. My mom would never say anything like that. What are you trying to pull on me? Mark continued to laugh and then responded, I forgot to mention that they were enjoying the bottle of wine you had in your closet, and I think Gary got your mom a little tipsy. She said she thinks we're good together and you need to get over Frank. She wants you to stay here with me, and since you don't have your pajamas with you, she hopes there will be stains on the sheets in the morning. She said to tell you to be sure to change them when you get up, but I told her I'd be happy to take care of that. He stopped talking and leaned forward to give a kiss to Carol on the forehead. She was very red, and when she broke the kiss, she said, I find it hard to believe she could say that, my own mother. She looked into Mark's eyes, attempting to answer the question of what she saw there. She was very red. They were already engaged in the activity within minutes. He looked at her with a smile and said, Don't let me forget to change the linens in the morning. I'm sure your mom will ask when we're meeting them for breakfast. For breakfast? What does that mean? Your mom wants us to meet them at IHOP for breakfast at 11 a.m. I think it'll be more of a brunch. We can skip church for a week. I guess she said they were bringing Chrissy and that we had no excuse not to stay up as late as we wanted. Mark was in his living room, lying on the couch, and thinking about the wonderful evening and morning that he had spent with Carol. It was 2:00 in the afternoon. As soon as they arrived, Marianne, Gary, and Chrissy were already seated and waiting for them to arrive. Chrissy was happy to see her mother again, and she was smiling on both of the adults as they entered the room. Chrissy was also laughing and waving. He laughed when Carol blushed and lightly slapped his arm after he said, Sorry we're late, I had to do some laundry. Mark said this as they sat down at the table. Throughout the course of the meal, they continued to make jokes about blue pills, sheets, and wine, repeatedly interjecting them into the conversation. Chrissy appeared to be perplexed by the adults, as evidenced by the fact that she looked at one of them multiple times with a questioning expression on her face. At a later time, when they were saying their goodbyes in the parking lot of the restaurant, Mark kissed Carol and Chrissy and then gave Marianne a particularly tight hug. As he hugged her, he whispered in her ear, Thank you so much for your suggestions last night. It was the push we needed. Marianne smiled at him and then pulled him to her again so he could whisper back, I think you two are good together. You're exactly what she's needed for a long time. And Gary and I took the opportunity to test his recipe. She laughed, turned, and took her husband under her arm to walk to their car. Mark was standing in the parking lot, waving as the four of them drove away, a smile playing across his face. In response to the ringing of his mobile phone, which prompted him to get up from the couch, he assumed that it was Carol and answered the call with a cheery "Hi, Mark." Mark recognized the voice of Joseph K. and responded, Yes, it's me. What can I do for you, Joseph? I am calling you, Mark, to discuss your offer to speak with Carrie after we have gone over all of the information that you have provided to us. At the moment, she is staying at our residence, and she has requested that we extend an invitation to you to join us for a cup of coffee so that she can have a conversation with you. She didn't want to call on her own because, as far as I can tell, she is afraid that you will hang up on her. Mark was taken aback by Joseph's call and hesitated before responding, I guess I could. Do you want me to come over right now? I don't have anything planned for today. Would you like me to come over? The response was, Okay, I'll be right over there. If you could, we'd really appreciate it. As he left the house, Mark was a little worried, wondering exactly what Carrie wanted to tell him. As he walked into his former mother-in-law's house, he immediately thought of all the previous times he had been there. They had all been occasions when he had enjoyed walking through that door, but this was not one of them. Carrie wasn't home yet when he arrived, and Joseph and Nancy asked him to join them in the kitchen after they had poured 4 cups of coffee. Joseph said, "Nancy and I will let you and Carrie talk alone, and we will go into the living room." They took their 2 cups and left, and within seconds, Carrie walked into the kitchen and sat down across from Mark. Mark was amazed at how good she looked. Her hair had grown back enough to be styled a little, and her hair color looked good. He noticed that she was thinner than when he had last seen her and had dark circles under her eyes. She looked nervous, and he wondered what she was going to say to him. As she nervously twirled her handkerchief in her hands, finally, he decided to melt the ice by saying, "You seem to be recovering well, Carrie." "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you coming to talk to me on such short notice." Her voice was softer than he remembered, and she kept twisting her handkerchief as she spoke. He wondered if he had cried as he saw her eyes fill with tears. "It's not a problem, Carrie," she said. "I hope it wasn't a problem because of the fact that it could have waited until a more convenient time for you. Where are you with your memory issue? Do you feel like you're beginning to remember things yet?" She responded with a shake of her head and said, "I only remember a few things from the past year and a half. During my time at Crosby & Knox, the receptionist was kind enough to take me on a tour of the establishment and share some information with me about my time there. After speaking with her, I was able to figure out some things that seemed familiar to me, and I was also able to figure out some. When I worked there, I didn't remember anything about her, but I did learn that we were good friends during my time there. However, I didn't remember anything about her either. It was a very distressing experience. I can only imagine what it would have been like. Is there anything you would like me to discuss with you, or are there things that you believe I could assist you in getting better?" Mark discovered that conversing with her was less difficult than he had anticipated. Carrie presented him with a smile and stated, "I do have a few questions. I spent a lot of time talking to Susan, and she really helped me understand some of the things I did." She was still fiddling with her handkerchief and periodically dabbed her eyes with it. Mark took another sip of coffee and said, "Don't be afraid to ask me anything. I'll try to be as honest with you as possible. Before I ask, I want to tell you that I am truly sorry for the way I treated you. If I hadn't seen copies of the letters and talked to the others, I never would have believed I could have done that." She wiped her eyes more often now, and Mark had nothing to say to that. There was no way he could bring himself to say, "It's okay," considering what he'd had to endure as a result of her cheating and its aftermath. Carrie broke the silence by continuing, "I only have vague memories of Bradley and nothing about our times. All I know about it is second-hand information." She was silent for almost a minute before she continued, "I've seen pictures of him and heard his description from some of the people at the law firm. He wasn't well liked, and I have no idea what I could find in him. I've even been to his apartment, and if my clothes and belongings weren't there, I'd never believe I lived with him." The tears were flowing faster and faster, and she had to keep wiping her eyes. The silence that Mark had been sitting in continued as he waited for Carrie to approach him with questions. Again, after a lengthy period of silence, she continued, "There was one question that none of the others could give me a complete answer to. I wanted to know how you knew about what I was doing. I know it had something to do with email, but I don't know how." In his explanation to her, Mark detailed how he had found the initial message and how it had led him to the other messages. During the time that he was speaking, she opened a drawer and took out a stack of papers that were torn and battered. These were the letters that he had given to her parents. It was then that he revealed to her that she had been the one who had initially informed him about purchasing the lingerie set. He explained to her how the mention of the lingerie set had caught his attention. His narrative continued with the details that she had shared with him regarding the purse and the earrings. After she had finished listening to him recount the lies that she had told him, she looked at him in a horrified manner. After he had finished, they had to wait for her to retrieve her composure and wipe her tear-filled eyes before they could proceed. When she was finally able to do so, she said, "I know you think it's easy for me to say this, but I really do." She then proceeded to say, "Forgive me for lying. While we're on the subject of letters, can you tell me about the one where Bradley and I were joking about my chauffeur? She asked a few minutes later. I wish you hadn't asked, he responded. I wish you hadn't asked. Were you joke that your chauffeur would get you to him? You're talking about me. Every trip you made to the state capitol, I drove you to the airport and carried your luggage to the check-in counter. I delivered you to him and even carried your bag with the expensive lingerie you were going to wear for him. You both thought it was funny. Just thinking about that bit of information he had gleaned from the emails made him angry again, so he continued, you both weren't just joking about it. You both also talked about how you would have to talk me into calling your hotel room at the beginning of the evening. He went on to describe how he always called around 9:45 and how he was able to prove that she was not in the room before or after his calls. The fact that he was still upset about this was something that she could easily see. She started crying once more, but after a couple of minutes, she was able to compose herself and say, I'm so sorry, Mark. I just can't understand how I could have done that. Before continuing, Mark took a deep gulp of his coffee and said, It's all in the past now, Carrie. I still get upset when I remember some things, but I've had plenty of time to get over almost all of it. The conversation then shifted away from the topic of the letters and moved on to the subject of her medical condition. She explained to Mark that she was experiencing seizures on a sporadic basis and that the doctors were giving her a variety of medications in an effort to bring them under control. Because of her emotional state, she was unable to think about her work, and she had already resigned from her position at Crosby and Knox. Due to the fact that her parents were consulting with a lawyer, she anticipated that they would initiate legal action against the insurance company as well as Bradley's estate in order to seek compensation for the injuries she sustained in the accident. Following approximately 15 minutes of idle chatter, Mark made the announcement that it was time for him to depart. I know you'll probably never be able to forgive the new Carrie who betrayed you so horribly, but I'm the same old Carrie again. I don't remember cheating on you or anything like that. Maybe if we went out to dinner or some other date, you could fall in love with the old Carrie again someday, she said, all of this quickly, wanting to get it all out before he could say anything to stop her. Before you go, Mark, I wanted to ask you if you think we could go on a date. I know you'll probably never be able to forgive the new Carrie who let you down so horribly. Mark thought about what to say before answering, I'm sorry, Carrie. There is no old or new Carrie in my mind, there is only one Carrie, the one I fell in love with and then lost to Trey. It took me a long time to get over her, but I'm happy with where I've come to. I know that's not what you want to hear, and I understand that. As he spoke, she began to cry quietly again. She asked him, Did you find someone else, as he was getting up to leave, and he hesitated once more before answering, not knowing how his words would affect her. It was his response, I believe so, Carrie. I think so. Is it the woman with the dark hair who was accompanied by the young girl? In response to the question, Mark's expression changed to one of surprise as he stated, Yes, that is her. What clues did you have? My parents saw her when they were in the house. They told me about her, Carrie said, still wiping her eyes as she spoke. Finally, she said, you deserve someone who will treat you better than me. After she finished speaking, she turned and ran out of the room. Mark left the room and was gone long before Carrie's parents realized that he and Carrie were no longer in the kitchen. A month later, on a pleasant Saturday afternoon in April, Gary and Mark used a rented truck to move Carol and Chrissy from their apartment to Mark's house. Things were going so well between them that they decided to find out if they were meant to be together. Chrissy was excited to have a yard to play in and her own big room. Mark's computer had been moved to a corner of the living room, and the room it was in was now freshly painted and decorated for a little girl. There was a large box in the garage that contained a child's playset and swing set that was waiting to be assembled. The three of them started going to church on a regular basis every Sunday. Soon after, Mark noticed that Carol's parents did not attend the same church very often. He didn't give it much thought until he realized that Carol and Chrissy were meant to be together. 4 months after Carol moved in with him, the minister announced that they were getting married this coming Saturday and that anyone from the congregation was welcome to attend the wedding. They decided that a small, informal wedding was what they needed and chose their church rather than City Hall for the ceremony. Chrissy was thrilled that she would be her mother's only flower maid and that she would soon have a new father. Mark was quick to let her know that Frank Jansen would always be her father, but that he would be happy to be her father. He and Carol agreed that Chrissy would keep her father's last name, even if they made a legal adoption. Mark insisted that the sacrifice Frank had made would not result in him losing his only child, and Mark and Carol spent an hour on the phone with Frank's parents explaining their upcoming wedding and their plans to keep Chrissy in the Jansens' lives. The conversation ended with a promise to visit Chrissy's paternal grandparents for a week for the rest of the summer. Mark couldn't wait to meet them, and they decided that this trip could be their honeymoon. During their uncomplicated wedding ceremony, which went off without a hitch, friends and family gathered at the church. It was obvious to some that Carol was pregnant, and Chrissy made sure that everyone in the church knew that she was expecting twin brothers. It was difficult to determine which Chrissy was more excited about, the fact that Mark was now her father or the fact that she was expecting two brothers. A week later, when Mark was changing the exhaust system before a trip to visit the Jansens, he ran into his former brother-in-law, Robert Kane. He was surprised to learn that Robert and Susan had accompanied Carrie to the wedding the previous week. They had only stayed until the end of the service, as Carrie had found it much more difficult to be there than she had expected. Mark, for his part, had a hard time understanding how Carrie could have come to his wedding. Why was she so interested in being there? At the time that I informed her about my affair with Carol, I am aware of how upset she was. The fact that she witnessed our wedding must have kept her occupied, Robert responded. Now she is attempting to get over you as you are trying to get over her. She believed that if she were to witness your wedding, it would make it simpler for her to move on with her life. The men continued to engage in idle chatter until Robert declared, "I almost forgot to tell you, Carol's claim against Bradley Knox's insurance company has been settled." Despite the fact that it bothered her a great deal, she expressed that she was relieved that she went. In spite of the fact that it does not appear that she will ever be able to return to work, she was able to acquire nearly $2 million. A portion of the agreement stipulated that she would be given his apartment, and as a result, she currently resides there. She expressed the hope that living there will assist her in regaining memories that she had lost, but we were unable to determine the reason why she wanted to do this. From my own point of view, I do not believe that happens. The medical professionals appeared to believe that she had recovered everything that was possible to recover. Because of the constant reminders of that, I am concerned that it will not be beneficial to her mental state. Taking into account that he has passed away, that you have remarried, and that she only remembers the happy times she spent with you, I believe that it is a mistake. 2 years passed quickly for Mark and Carol. Their 2 sons, Frank and Mark Jr., were joined by a younger sister, Chrissy. They named their daughter Marianne in honor of her grandmother. Their house was beginning to feel cramped for their growing family, and they were already debating whether to add an addition or buy a larger one. They hadn't made a decision yet, figuring they had another year before they would be forced to make a decision. It was a peaceful Friday evening when Carol picked up the phone, and after a brief pause, she called Mark to the phone. When Mark picked up the phone, he was taken aback to learn that Joseph Kane had actually called him. "I had to give you a call, Mark, so that you wouldn't stumble upon this information in the newspaper the following day. She has passed away. When Robert went to see her today, he discovered her hidden away. It appears that she passed away yesterday at some point." The news took Mark by surprise, and he lost control of himself for a moment. His reaction was enough for Carol to realize something was wrong, and she stepped forward and took his hand in hers. Her reassuring touch and concerned look brought him back to the present. He was happily at home with Carol and their children. His brief reaction was caused by a flash of long-forgotten memories of Carrie, memories he knew could never be completely erased. He smiled encouragingly at Carol, then said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Joseph. All of you, Nancy and Robert, please accept my deepest condolences on the loss of your loved one. Do you have any indication as to what took place with her?" Joseph paused for a moment before responding, I am concerned that she took her own life. There is a note that she left for my mother and me, but the majority of the contents are private and intended only for us. It was important to her that we convey to you that her love for you could never end. Apparently, she made an effort to get rid of the memories of you, but she was never successful in doing so. It was also important to her that you understand that it was not just you who was affected by it. She had ongoing health issues, both physical and mental, and they played a role in it as well. I had no idea that she was dealing with so many issues. Since the day that I came to your house to see her, I have not communicated with her in any way. It is with deep regret that I learned that something of this nature took place. Thank you in advance for letting me know if there is anything I can do to assist you or Nancy. After exchanging a few more phrases that were familiar to them, the conversation came to an end. A few days later, Mark and Carol went to a memorial service for Carrie, where they were able to convey their personal condolences to her family. Only her friend and the receptionist were present at the service from Crosby and Knox. Epilogue. A few months later, Mark learned that he was the heir to $500,000 from Carrie's inheritance. Most of her estate had gone to her parents and brother. Mark and Carol had long debated whether to keep the inheritance for themselves, as Mark worried that it would bring back constant memories of Carrie into their lives. In the end, they kept it and set up 4 trust funds for their children's education. The balance was used to buy a new, larger home. They found that they often remembered Carrie and her generosity, but it didn't give them any trouble. Congratulations on watching. I really hope you had a good time, and if you did, please subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.